Somewhere south of every coastline you have ever heard of, past the last shipping lane, past the last radio signal, there is water so cold and so empty that the men who cross it stop talking about it when they get home. They just go quiet. And more than one of them, when pressed hard enough by a curious friend or a nosy relative, has said some version of the same sentence: "I saw something out there I can't explain, and I'd rather not try." This video is about what they saw, or what they think they saw, in the far southern seas near Antarctica. A pale, massive shape that some crews swear moved with purpose against the current, that some swear had limbs, and that almost every single account, independently, across years and ships and languages, ends up calling by the same unsettling name. Not monster. Not beast. The word they reach for means human. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because whether you walk away believing or not, you are not going to forget this one. Let's start with the place itself, because the location is doing half the work in this story before a single witness even opens their mouth. The Southern Ocean is the ring of water that wraps entirely around Antarctica, and it is unlike any other ocean on the planet. There is no landmass anywhere along its path to slow the wind down, so the wind just keeps building, uninterrupted, for thousands of miles. That is why this stretch of water produces some of the largest and most violent waves on Earth, and why the storms down there don't blow through in an afternoon the way a storm might pass over a coastal town. They sit. They linger for days. The water is colder and denser than almost anywhere else people actually work, and beneath the surface it drops into some of the least explored depths on the planet. We genuinely have better maps of the surface of Mars than we have of large sections of the Southern Ocean seafloor. That is not an exaggeration meant to spook you. It is simply a fact about how little of our own planet's water has ever been surveyed, because almost nobody has ever had a reason, or the ability, to go look. The people who do go down there are not tourists. They are fishing crews, ice researchers, whale surveyors, and the occasional naval or scientific vessel doing long, brutal deployments in some of the harshest working conditions in the world. These are people who spend months at a time on the water, who know the difference between a wave shadow and a shark fin from half a mile away without even thinking about it, because their entire job depends on reading the ocean correctly. That detail matters, because when the Ningen stories started circulating, the people telling them were not, for the most part, casual travelers spinning tales for attention. They were, according to the accounts, working professionals who had spent years learning exactly what belongs in that water and exactly what does not. So what actually gets described? The reports tend to follow a similar shape, if you'll forgive the pun. It usually happens during the strange half-light of the polar day or night, when the sky and the sea blur into the same flat grey, and shapes are hard to judge. Someone on watch notices something pale sitting low in the water, and their first instinct, every time, is that it's ice. Ice is everywhere out there. It's the most boring possible explanation, and it's usually the correct one. But then, in some versions of the story, the ice does something ice is not supposed to do. It appears to hold a steady course instead of drifting freely with the current. A second or third crew member gets called over. They stand at the rail together and argue about what they are looking at. And in the most dramatic versions of these accounts, people describe a pale mass with something like a rounded top, long trailing limb-like shapes below it, and in the versions that really spread online, hands. Fingers that seem to open and close in the water. Now here's where I want to be completely straightforward with you, because a good investigation only works if we are honest about the weak points along with the strong ones. There is no photograph of a Ningen that has ever been authenticated. There is no specimen, no bone, no tissue sample, nothing that any marine biologist has ever examined and confirmed as belonging to an unknown species. If you search for Ningen photos online, what you'll find are grainy, low-resolution images that trace back to internet forums, and several of them have already been identified as either digitally altered or lifted from unrelated sources, including at least one that appears to be a rendering rather than a photograph at all. This is important, because a big part of what makes this legend feel credible to people is the assumption that there's photographic evidence floating around out there. There really isn't, at least not any that has held up to scrutiny. The origin of the name itself is also worth digging into, because it tells you a lot about how the whole legend actually spread. The stories trace back to Japanese internet forums in the mid-2000s, where anonymous posters shared second-hand accounts, often framed as something a relative or a friend of a friend who worked on a fishing or research vessel supposedly witnessed. From there the story moved the way these things always move now, through screenshots, translated blog posts, and video essays, each retelling adding a little more detail than the last. By the time the story had made several laps around the internet, the creature had grown from something vaguely described as pale and large into a fully detailed 30-meter humanoid with hands, forward-facing eyes, and in some tellings a face that reportedly turned to look back at the people watching it. That evolution matters because it is exactly how folklore has always worked, long before the internet existed. A vague, unsettling experience gets described by one person. The next person who repeats it fills in a gap with their own imagination. The next person after that does the same. Nobody is necessarily lying at any single step in that chain. They are just doing what humans have always done with an incomplete, frightening image, finishing it. And once a story like this gets attached to a name as evocative as Ningen, meaning simply human being, the name itself becomes part of the engine that keeps the story alive. Think about how differently this legend would land if the very first person to describe it had just called it a big pale blob. There'd be no dread in that. But call it human, and suddenly every retelling comes preloaded with the most unsettling possible frame, not an animal in the water, but something that looks like us. So does that mean there's nothing real behind any of it? Not necessarily, and this is where I think the fair, honest answer sits somewhere in the middle rather than at either extreme. The ocean absolutely does hide things from us, and history backs that up. The giant squid was considered pure sailor's myth for centuries until specimens started washing ashore, and eventually, one was filmed alive in its natural habitat. Deep-sea anglerfish, glowing sharks, entirely new whale species, these have all been documented within the last few decades, some of them within the last few years. So the general claim that the deep ocean contains large, unfamiliar animals we haven't fully catalogued is not a fringe position. It's actually just standard marine biology. Researchers will tell you, without hesitation, that we've mapped more of the surface of the moon than we have of our own ocean floor. But here's the distinction that I think gets lost every time this story goes viral again. Something being large and unknown is a completely different claim than something being humanoid, 30 meters long, and casually visible at the surface next to ships in open water. A creature that size, breathing at the surface, moving in a straight, deliberate line against the current, in an area that does get crossed by fishing fleets, research vessels, and increasingly by tourist and scientific expeditions, would be almost impossible to keep hidden for 2 decades. It's one thing to say the deep abyss holds mysteries. The deep abyss is, by definition, a place we almost never see. It's another thing entirely to say a specific, enormous, surface-visible creature has been repeatedly witnessed by name for 20 years and yet somehow left behind zero verifiable evidence, not one clear photo from the thousands of phones and cameras that now travel on virtually every vessel that crosses that water. That gap between the ocean could hide something like this, and the ocean has, apparently, been hiding this exact thing in plain sight for 2 decades, is where most serious skeptics land. And it lines up with what we know about how human perception works in exactly the conditions these sightings describe. Low light, high stress, extreme cold, physical exhaustion from long shifts, and a surface made of ice that naturally forms pale, irregular, sometimes eerily human-like shapes, as it's carved by wind and waves. Add to that the well-documented psychological tendency researchers call pareidolia, our brain's tendency to detect faces and human forms in random or ambiguous patterns, because recognizing another person quickly was, for most of human evolutionary history, a matter of survival. Put a tired, cold person in a grey, monotone landscape and give them an ambiguous shape to look at, and the brain doesn't shrug. It fills in a face. It fills in limbs. It fills in intention, because that's what human brains have always been built to do first and question second. None of that means every single witness is simply wrong or careless. Experienced sailors are, generally speaking, good at their jobs, and their instinct to distrust an unusual shape in the water is often exactly the instinct that keeps a ship safe. But being skilled at reading the ocean doesn't make anyone immune to the same perceptual tricks that affect the rest of us, especially in conditions specifically designed by nature to produce them: low visibility, extreme fatigue, monochrome surroundings, and genuine physical danger that keeps adrenaline running high. In many documented cases of unexplained sea creature sightings across history, once a clear photograph or a recovered specimen finally settled the question, the answer turned out to be mundane: a piece of drifting ice, a dead whale in an unusual position, an oarfish, a rare but entirely known species simply behaving in a way nobody on board had personally witnessed before. So where does that leave the Ningen? I think the honest answer is that it sits in a genuinely interesting space between real oceanography and internet folklore, and that both halves of that sentence deserve respect rather than dismissal. The Southern Ocean truly is one of the least explored, least understood environments on Earth, and it is entirely reasonable to expect that new, strange, and sometimes very large creatures remain to be discovered down there. That part isn't hype, it's just where marine biology currently stands. At the same time, the specific legend of a 30-meter, human-shaped creature with hands and forward-facing eyes traces far more cleanly back to an internet forum in the 2000s than it does to any documented scientific encounter. And every piece of evidence that has surfaced since then has failed to hold up once anyone looked closely. That doesn't make the people who report seeing something out there liars. It just means the most likely explanation is a very old, very human habit: taking something genuinely strange and unsettling, and quietly turning it, without ever quite meaning to, into a story about ourselves. And maybe that's actually the most interesting part of this whole case, more interesting than whether the creature is real. Ask yourself why, out of every possible shape a sailor's imagination could reach for in the dark, the story keeps landing on the same one. Not a sea serpent. Not a giant squid. Not a shark or a whale grown impossibly large. A person. A pale, silent figure with a head, shoulders, arms, and a face that some witnesses swear turned to look back at them. There's something almost too on the nose about a legend born in one of the loneliest places on the planet turning out to be, at its core, a story about not being alone. Whether that's evidence of something waiting in the deep, or evidence of exactly how the human mind behaves when it's cold, exhausted, and staring into a stretch of water where nothing is supposed to be looking back, is genuinely up for you to decide. I'll leave you with the same question that keeps this story alive every time it resurfaces online. If you were standing at that rail, in that grey half-light, staring down at a pale shape that seemed, just for a second, to be holding its own course against the current, what would you actually believe you were looking at? Let me know where you land in the comments, and if this kind of deep ocean mystery